The thing about peace is that you don't realize how expensive it is until someone tries to auction it off right from under your feet. And for me, that realization hit the moment I saw a pastel pink casserole dish heading toward my front porch. My name's Elias Thorne, I'm 64, and I spent the better part of my life as a master land surveyor. A job that basically means I get paid to tell people exactly where their world ends and someone else's begins, which is a skill that comes in real handy when your neighbor happens to be the president of a power-hungry homeowners association. I bought my slice of heaven back in the late 90s, just a rugged, overgrown 4-acre lot sitting on the edge of Blackwood Lake, long before the developers moved in and started carving up the ridge into cookie-cutter mansions with manicured lawns and zero personality. I'd spent 25 years paying taxes on that dirt, dreaming of the day I'd retire to a cabin where the only alarm clock was the sunrise hitting the water. But I guess I forgot that in a place like, the Highlands, some people think a gated entrance gives them a key to everyone else in Oppo's life. It all started on a Tuesday in April when Martha Higgins, a woman whose smile reminded me of a shark evaluating a meal, knocked on my door with that casserole and welcome to the neighborhood, speech that felt about as sincere as a used car commercial. She was the HOA president, a local realtor who'd made a killing selling those ridgetop houses by promising people lakefront lifestyle, even though the community into Oppo's legal boundary stopped 50 feet short of the actual shoreline. We sat on my porch, and as she gestured toward my private beach, the one I'd spent 20 years clearing of brush and hauling gravel for, she said, "Oh, Elias, the previous owner was always so gracious about letting the families use this path to the water, and I'm sure a man of your character would want to keep that beautiful tradition alive." Now, I'm not a mean man, so I told her that as long as people kept it quiet and picked up their trash, I didn't mind a few neighbors taking a dip. But what I didn't know was that Martha didn't hear yes, occasionally, she heard this is now public property, and she'd already spent a decade selling that lie to every homeowner in the zip code. By the time summer rolled around, my quiet mornings were replaced by the screams of toddlers, the smell of cheap sunscreen, and people dragging kayaks through my flower beds like they owned the place. But I kept my cool until the day I walked down to the community clubhouse to pay my utility fees. There, pinned to the corkboard like a trophy, was a glossy architectural rendering of a massive $120,000 mahogany dock with a gazebo and a wet bar, and the caption underneath read, "Phase 1 of the Highlands Private Beach Club." I felt the blood start to simmer in my veins because that, private beach club, was drawn right on top of my boat ramp on the land I'd surveyed myself down to the fraction of an inch, and that was the moment I realized Martha wasn't just asking for a favor. She was staging a hostile takeover. I called her that evening, trying to be the bigger person, and I'll never forget the way her voice went from sugary sweet to ice cold the second I mentioned the word trespassing, She laughed this dry, condescending sound and told me, "Elias, honey, we've used that beach for 15 years. It's a prescriptive easement by now, and frankly, the board has already collected the special assessment from the residents. So the project is moving forward with or without your blessing." And, she hung up on me before I could tell her that, usage, doesn't an Oppo's T equal, ownership, when the owner is a guy who literally writes the maps for a living. So I did what any self-respecting surveyor would do. I went to the basement, pulled out my original 1997 deed, my stamped survey plats, and my tax receipts. And then I called an old friend of mine named Sarah, who specializes in property litigation. Sarah told me one thing I'll never forget, "Elias, an HOA is like a playground bully with a checkbook, and if you want to stop them, you don't just say no. You make it so expensive to say yes that they choke on it." I spent the next 3 months being the cranky old man, or at least that's what the neighborhood Facebook group called me, as I installed motion-activated 4K cameras hidden in the oak trees and began staking out my property line with bright orange markers that Martha's cronies would rip out every other night. I didn't engage, I didn't yell, I just sat on my porch with a notebook and a stopwatch, logging every time a resident stepped over the line, every time Martha's beach committee came down to measure for the dock, and every time someone left a bag of dog waste on my driveway as an, quote, gift, end quote, I was building a fortress of evidence, waiting for the day the heavy machinery arrived. And that day came on a foggy Monday morning in October when a massive yellow excavator came clanking down the ridge road, followed by a truck from, end quote, Vance and Amp, Sons Construction, end quote. I walked down to the end of my gravel drive, holding a manila folder, and met the foreman, a guy named Rick who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, and I handed him a copy of my deed and a temporary restraining order I'd had a judge sign 48 hours prior. I told him, end quote, Rick, I'm sure Martha told you this was community land, but if you drop that bucket on this side of the orange tape, you're violating a court order, and I'm going to have a sheriff, who's currently sitting in the bushes about 50 yards back, come out and hand you a pair of bracelets, end quote. Rick looked at the paperwork, looked at the orange tape, and then looked up at the ridge where Martha was standing in a white designer tracksuit, screaming at the top of her lungs that I was, end quote, robbing the children of their summer, end quote. Rick just shook his head, climbed back in his cab, and backed that 12-ton machine all the way up the hill while Martha's face turned a shade of purple I didn't think was biologically possible. She came charging down the hill, her heels sinking into the mud, shrieking that she was going to sue me for every penny I had, that I was end quote, community terrorist, end quote, and that the HOA had more lawyers than I had gray hairs, but I just smiled and pointed at the tree behind her where a small green light was blinking. End quote. That's a camera, Martha, and it's been recording you for 6 months, including the night you and your husband tried to spray paint into Oppos. Get out in Oppos, on my boathouse, end quote, I said, watching the wind go right out of her sails as she realized I was into Oppos. T playing a game of chicken. I was playing a game of chess. But the real kicker, the thing that really brought the whole house of cards down, was something I found out through a public records request, Sarah, and I filed a week later. It turns out that Vance and Amp, Sons Construction, the company Martha hired for the $120,000 dock, was owned by Martha's brother-in-law, and they had been the only company invited to bid on the project, which is a massive violation of the HOA's own bylaws and state transparency laws. We didn't just have a property dispute anymore. We had a fraud case, and when I leaked that little tidbit to a few of the, end quote, reasonable, end quote, neighbors who were tired of their monthly dues skyrocketing, the mutiny was faster than a wildfire in a dry forest. The emergency board meeting was held in a packed gymnasium 2 weeks later, and I've never seen a woman look as small as Martha did when I stood up in the back of the room with a microphone and a projector. I showed the drone footage of the construction attempt. I showed the bank records of the, end quote, donations, end quote, Martha had received from her brother-in-law, and then I showed the final map, the one that proved the HOA didn't own a single inch of the shoreline. By the time I sat down, the crowd wasn't into Oppos, T looking at me like a villain. They were looking at Martha like she was the one who'd been picking their pockets for a decade, and 3 board members resigned on the spot just to avoid being named in the lawsuit I was about to file. Martha's real estate license was eventually suspended. The HOA had to pay me a settlement that covered my legal fees and then some, and I used that money to build a beautiful, tall, wrought iron fence that runs the length of the ridge. Not because I'm a mean neighbor, but because good fences make good neighbors, especially when the neighbors think, end quote, sharing, end quote, means, end quote, stealing, end quote. Now, I sit on my porch in the mornings, the lake is glass, the air is quiet, and the only people I see are the ones I've actually invited for a beer, but I still see the residents up on the ridge, looking down at the water they can't touch, and I wonder if they've learned the lesson yet. Is it really, end quote, community, end quote, if it's built on a lie, or is it just a club for people who think the rules dawn into Oppos? T applied to them as long as they have a nice view? I've seen it 100 times in my career. People get a little bit of power and a fancy title, and they think they can redraw the world however they want. But at the end of the day, the dirt doesn't lie, and neither does a deed. I'm curious, though, have any of you ever dealt with an HOA that thought they owned your backyard, or a neighbor who treated your kindness like an invitation to take over? Drop a comment below and let me know how you handled it, because I'm starting to think these, end quote, Martha's, end quote, are a lot more common than we'd like to admit. And sometimes, the only way to get your peace back is to fight for every inch of it.